So today's webinar is going to cover community specification and a little bit of the OpenChain reference library. The reason is twofold. As OpenChain has gone through ISO, we've had a lot of interest in how and why it became a standard, which is related to the project. But we've also had interest in the entire concept of building out community specifications. So how did OpenChain do it? And as it happens, there's a new mechanism for creating community specifications, which are sort of pre-baked for formal standardization down the road. On the OpenChain reference library, we've had a ton of questions incoming recently about how people can get reference material. And I think a lot of people are aware that some material is on our site, and they're aware in concept of our GitHub, but perhaps people, A, don't realize the scale of the reference library, and B, perhaps when it comes to navigating GitHub and so on, people aren't so experienced in that. So we're going to take a brief look at those items. As always, just showing the antitrust policy notice. We put this up at every meeting. If people have any questions about the antitrust policy, well, they can get the full policy on the Linux Foundation website. And we also have counsel, Andrew Updegrove, who can assist with answering questions as needed. Well, you know what? Let's dive right into the topic. So the first person to speak today will be Seth. And Seth is leading up a lot of the activity that we see with open source and standardization. This is something that I think people have a good view of some, let's say, OpenChain, but they don't necessarily have a solid view of how Joint Development Foundation has been building out incredible infrastructure. So we're going to take a look at that today. And just for reference, without Seth, we would never have managed to turn OpenChain into an ISO standard. And without Joint Development Foundation, we wouldn't have done it. We were the first, and SPDX will be the second. But as things move forward, there are methodologies appearing to get this done more smoothly and more effectively. And that's where community specification comes in. It's pretty new. 4 months old. I'm sharing the screen because community specification, just like OpenChain, is extremely open, and it's actually hosted on GitHub. Seth, if it's all right, I'll hand over to you to run through roughly what this is, why it is, and what type of projects could adopt it, whether new or existing. And you know, your background is pure standardization, so I think your perspective will be super valuable to our community. It's all right, I'll hand over to you.
I have to admit, I'm a little intimidated speaking to Dave Marr because he knows more about this sort of stuff than, he's forgotten more about this sort of stuff than I'll ever know. And so Dave, I'm fairly sure you're aware of the Joint Development Foundation having been merged to the Linux Foundation, I think effective June of 2019 was when the date was. And you may know a little about the Joint Development Foundation sort of standard documents, which were broken into a project charter and working group charters. And the way that the process was intended to work, and this was something that Dave Rudin at Microsoft sort of experimented with and developed this idea simply because they needed to spin up a specification setting body or a specification effort. And so many of them get so involved and so customized that you can spend an awful lot of money trying to bring one to the, and open one up. And sometimes they just don't thrive simply because of the latency of getting all the lawyers to agree and so forth. And so Dave took the sort of best of breed kinds of terms and licenses and created the Joint Development Foundation package of documents, which essentially states the project charter starts with the um, scope of the project and kind of the governance model that it's going to take on and whether or not it's going to be funded. And then those several areas are choices that the founding members will make. And then the subsequents are the working group charters, and there's usually at least one working group. Sometimes there are multiple working groups. And we gave a set of licenses that are pretty standardized for copyright, source code, and IPR. And so the JDF templates support anything from a RAND to I think W3C license, and a number of others. And then that works. Each one is customized for either IP or source code or copyright. And each working group can have its own set within the boundaries of the licenses that are defined in the working group charters. And every once in a while, somebody will try to put in a new license, and we say no. The documents are fixed. You can either work with this or you can go off and you can create something customized. And so that has worked pretty well for a number of the organizations that started up under JDF and that have started up under Linux Foundation. But we've also found that in particular, there tend to be scaling issues with the legacy JDF documents, simply because you've got to track a lot of working group charters, which are essentially contributor license agreements. And there's just a lot of document tracking that doesn't scale very well, because the whole goal of JDF was to build something that allowed for a quick implementation and that is economical to run. And as we kind of got along, we found that it wasn't very economical to run. And so we started experimenting with something that was even a little simpler. And so the community specification is something that, and by the way, the JDF runs on a series LLC model. So JDF is the parent, and then each one of the projects turns into a series LLC underneath that. And LF does that a lot with their LF projects, and JDF does that with the JDF projects. So with a community spec, one of the things we wanted to try to do was to simplify the operation as well as some of the licensing discussions. And so what we've tried to put together here is sort of a unified license that's one single community license that we call it, and it covers all the IP and the source code and the copyright in the single license, so that you're not dealing with it as with as many choices. The other thing that we've done is you can start this up. You can just clone the repo that's right here in the community spec repo and start a project. You don't even necessarily have to have an entity behind it. So that's why this community spec 1.0 is just a repo, and anybody can clone it and go start their own project, whether they are associated with JDF or Linux Foundation or anybody else. The thing that we're working on right now is to take the same conceptual basis of the community specification and its licenses, but also bake that in to essentially take the old JDF templates, but use the community specification model around that. And one of the things that the community specification really relies on is that the governance is essentially covered in the repository. So the benefits that we see coming out of this in the long run are that it's very easy to auto join, because you're using a CLA bot with GitHub, and or I suppose you could do it with GitLab as well, but you're using a bot in order for people to come in and register for their contributions. The governance is embedded in the repository, and the operations turn into a much simpler activity, so that it doesn't require a project manager. It can be done by the community itself more easily. Plus, it tends to fold in with some of the automation tools that Linux Foundation has been trying to work on so much, such it essentially, it has an auto join kind of function. It has an easy CLA bot in it that allows it to work. The thing that it doesn't do, or it doesn't do at least in this iteration, is that it doesn't really allow for multiple working groups. So one working group, one technical area is essentially the N that can be done under one community spec license. So the legacy JDF documents allow you to have multiple working groups under a single entity, single governance entity, whereas the community specifications would tend to be one working group, one project. So probably intended for a smaller scale operation than some of the others that we have, but in essence, a lot of people really prefer that. That's how they'd like to start. The other thing is that the community specification effort is intended to be seamless with the other JDF projects. So if you started a community specification piece of work just as a project, and then you decided that you wanted an entity, you could bring your documents up through that entity and create a series LLC underneath that as the project matured, and then later, assuming that the process for developing the specification was fairly tight, you would have the ability to migrate that into JDF International, which could then submit that into a pass process with JTC1. So there's, the goal here is lower operational cost, simplified spin up of a new group, and still maintain the pathway through the JDF process that would actually allow you to get up to an international specification, or at least an international submission to the JTC1. So that's the goal that we're doing. And we refer to the documents. So this community specification, which is just repo based, is active now. I don't know if anybody has spun one up yet, but and then what we're trying to do now is what we're creating is what we refer to as the release 5.0 documents, which are a little more formalized, which have a legal entity underneath them, and which you could use these community specification licenses, but in the traditional JDF documents. And so that is the piece that is still, it's in process right now. We haven't released what we refer to as the release 5 documents for JDF just yet, but we're kind of days away from that. And so that's the program of the community specification and the community specification licenses that are going to go into another revision of the JDF document and projects.
Hey, Seth, what's your preference on questions? You want to save them for the end or as we go?
No, let's have a conversation.
All right, cool. So question on are there sort of any target projects that are identified at this point as potentially being interested in having a specification and potentially go down the path of standardization?
There are, well, there's always a pipeline of projects of people who are interested in using the generalized JDF model. So, I think we've got about 13 projects under the JDF model. I think about 8 of them are unfunded and they're very small, kind of under the radar. And then there's about 5 that are funded that are good size. Take that back. It's about 7 or 8 now that are funded and good size projects. So, excuse me. What we're actually sort of seeing is that some of the existing projects have recognized the operational kind of complexities associated with the document set. So Trust over IP is one of the newer projects that you might be familiar with. And they've got like 8 working groups, and they're starting to see the problems of scale that 8 working groups in something like this has. So they're really interested in seeing if they can get the efficiencies out of the out of the community spec models with the new, at the new 5.0 revision of the documents, again, which hasn't yet been released. I am not aware of anybody who has created a community specification project from scratch, specifically from just the repository. I think people are interested in the concept, but nobody has started one, and truthfully, it hasn't been available for that long.
Yeah, understand, makes sense. Yeah, it's still very early stage.
Yeah, and you know how standards are. It takes a while for people to adopt new things, and truthfully, we need to have a debug run with it as well. But I'd say that there's a couple of projects right now that people are interested in starting up, and we're sort of waiting on the 5.0 documentation package. So we see that people sort of like what the package is going to do, but we don't. But we haven't released the more formalized, the entity-based package for public consumption yet. But we're talking to probably 3 projects that are interested, depending on whether it kind of passes their muster. We haven't yet distributed those to the public just yet.
Got it. Thanks, Seth.
I thought it was a pretty interesting decision, and a great one, to put the actual specification up on GitHub so people can not only get it from, let's say, JDF website, but proactively comment, raise issues, maybe even make suggestions for future iterations. It seems like from first principle, the idea here was to make the infrastructure of standardization collaborative, which is it's quite a big change, I guess, from traditional standardization, where if you go in with the methodology of a traditional standardization body, they don't necessarily expect you to also comment on their process and make suggestions as part of your normal day. So it's an interesting model.
Well, and the other side of what we see with the JDF projects is, because it's simpler, because it's faster, we tend to see people who were not previously involved in standards, who might be involved more in just sort of open source code or kind of informal gatherings, even though they want to create a normatively referenceable standard, they really don't have that kind of experience or that background. So if you compare sort of in the telecom markets, where you've got people who go to Etsy or Addis or 3GPP or something like that, these are really, really experienced standards people. And one of the things we see with JDF projects is people who don't have that kind of deep standards background are working together to try to create something that's a little bit out of their comfort zone, to be honest. And so there's things about making standards that you just really have to be careful about in the early going. And so I think that one of the things we're seeing is, and in some cases that's fine. If you want to go for a worldwide standard, then you really need to start it right and do it right. But if you just want to get 2 or 3 collaborators together and put something out that's covered by a legal entity, but has a relatively narrow focus, that's pretty straightforward to do. And originally we sort of thought that JDF was going to be the starting point for people, and then when they outgrew it, they would spin up their own organization. But we have found that some of the organizations have actually just scaled with it. They like it, they stuck with it, and they haven't spun it up. So we're sort of on 2 ends of the spectrum. Some of these guys are getting pretty large. Alliance for Open Media is a good size organization, doing an open source video codec, and they're getting a lot of notoriety. And they started, so they're on the sort of the more mature end of the JDF specification stack. And then we've got some a bunch of contributors doing a project like Uptain, which is a sort of a secure download to the to the CAN bus project. And it's really kind of a lot of individual contributors. And so they tend to be on the other end of that scale. And so, but all of them need a certain amount of help. And we're trying to reduce the amount of administrative help we have to give them so we can focus more on the sort of how do you write a spec and how do you get it out the door and how do you format it kind of things with the sort of few skilled people we've got at that area.
It's certainly a very interesting time. And Seth, thank you so much for that overview. I think that's one of the overviews that's going to disseminate through the project over time. And people are linked with other activities. So it's possible that they might actually need the community specification in a relatively short window for something they're already doing. So really appreciate you taking the time on that.
Very well could be. And Dave, if you're interested in this, in more information about this, you can reach out to Mike Dolan or Scott or David Rudin, because I know that you've been you're familiar with what we're doing with JDF, but perhaps I've never spoken to you about it in the past.
Right. And Seth, you're also involved with OMA, right?
I am.
Right. Okay. Cool.
So
yeah. All the more reason for us to
changed the
connect.
OMA model, so I am a contractor to OMA, but yeah, I'm with them. I work with Alan Soloway all the time.
Right on. Yeah. Great.
He's a good guy.
Yeah.
And I'm in San Diego.
All the more reason.
Yeah.
Well, after this COVID situation resolves, maybe we can grab a drink sometime.
I would love to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
I noticed that Ninoji-san from Toshiba has joined the call. Ninoji-san, you joined just as we were beginning the community spec. Great to have you here. Thank you for joining in the holiday.
Oh, hi guys. Thank you so much for your giving this interesting conversations. I really enjoyed it and very interestingly. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your time. Okay, the second part of this webinar, this will be relatively compact, but we're going to take a look at, also on GitHub, what the OpenChain reference material is like today. Our reference library has grown significantly. It's now well over 400 documents. And some of the things people will be very familiar with when they go to the reference library itself, things like our training slides, that was the first material. Though what people might not be super aware of is that while the training slides have all the official versions in English, our community has also built translations in various languages. So we've got Spanish, we've got Japanese, we've got Korean. The Spanish, by the way, is Argentinian Spanish, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. All of this material is available under CC0, effectively public domain, and probably all the way to today, the training slides are the most used part of our curriculum. So we see that going in many places. And for example, not just user companies, but also various providers have taken our slides and incorporated it in their vendor materials to assist clients. But there's a lot more than that in the actual reference library itself. Some of it came out of local work groups, and here I'll jump into the Supplier Leaflet. So the Supplier Leaflet has been created by the Japanese work group. It was initially created in Japanese and English. We've had it translated since then into Vietnamese, simplified, and traditional Chinese. And as a leaflet, it's tremendously useful, especially considering that we're entering the process point where OpenChain is going to be in many suppliers' hands, but they might not be familiar with open source itself. The Supplier Leaflet explicitly addresses this, essentially starting at the beginning and guiding people into understanding OpenChain across, I believe it's around 8 pages. And it means that even if someone's not familiar with open source, it provides supplementary material to familiarize them and to ground them in what we do. This particular supplier leaflet is something that we expect to see a lot of use of adjacent to things like our procurement education documentation. Now, alongside some of this material, we've had some interesting guides, flowcharts, and workflows contributed. But the next thing I want to show briefly is actually the policy templates. People very frequently ask, what type of open source policy can they have, can they use? And in this particular area, we have an official policy document which was contributed originally from the UK, from Moorcroft's law firm. It's in English, Japanese, and traditional Chinese. This policy template's interesting because it allows people to explore how they can make an open source policy without being prescriptive. Basically, it shows policy points and gives you options for how you fill out the policy. It's a spreadsheet available in Excel or open document format. I'd say after the reference material and after the supplier leaflet, definitely the policy template is one of the more important things we have in the library itself. And of course, our official policy is not alone. There's another one available, which is a FOSS contribution policy template. It's a different document. It's marked as a community contribution because it's not our primary policy document. But in essence, it came out of a government partnership summit in Paris in 2016. And it provides another way to frame policies. It's a little bit shorter than our full policy template, and it's there as an option for people to look at their reference material. Now, I mentioned we have sales and procurement support that's likely to be utilized a lot with the actual supplier leaflet. The sales and procurement material provides a grounding for procurement and sales departments to explicitly understand why OpenChain provides value in their workspace. The sales and procurement leaflet is about to be joined by a slide deck and a checklist, which again, basically provide tools for these departments to engage with OpenChain. This is particularly important because procurement departments, for example, may have minimal knowledge about open source, and their question is, do I need to include this ISO number, and if so, why? What's the benefit? Well, we answered that. Now, a lot of our material, you'll notice as I went through the repository that there's multiple documents with the same name. A lot of our material is available in print-ready formats and also various source formats like open document format, Word format, InDesign. And the idea here is because it's CC0, you can take this information and you can re-edit it. You can do anything you want with it for any purpose. Now, there are, of course, cases where we didn't design things to be reused in that manner, and that's where our case studies come in. We have a bunch of case studies available online, and these case studies come from organizations that have contributed their experience of adoption. Now, naturally, when there's a case study from a company like Toyota, that particular document is not under CC0. That particular document is not editable, and this is for obvious reasons. We want to make sure you have the case studies and you can get a printable format and share it as much as you desire. But at the same time, someone can't re-edit Toyota's case study to say something that it wasn't intended to. There are templates, so people can create their own case studies. At the moment, we've got English and Japanese. And there are community case studies where we have, outside of our very flashy format, which is designed for printing and so on, we've got plenty of other shorter case studies like Fujitsu on education, Hitachi on general overview. These case studies are available in the same manner as the others, Though you'll notice that there are also editable formats in there. That's not so that people can redo the case studies, that's so that people can get a slide and build from it on their own. Going back, we have some documents which probably are underutilized in our community. One good example would be that the checklists. We've got various checklists and metrics to evaluate source code, merger and acquisitions, compliance and rebuilding of code, and general conformance checklist. These checklists, I think, are probably a little underutilized because of our discovery for them not being explicit enough on the website, and that's something I'll certainly address. But the fact is that we have checklists on these topics right now. These checklists are available for anyone to use. They're also CC0 and editable. And we'll be building out that corpus of checklist material, first of all with sales and procurement, but then other departments, other activities as well. It's certainly something that is worth putting on your kind of it's there list. It may not be our tier 1 material, such as the training slides. It may not be our tier 2 material, such as the policy template, but it's certainly a solid part of the community materials. Another thing that's perhaps a little bit underutilized in our community is the Kanban Workflows. These are 2 documents. One is from the UK, a company in the UK, which is a partner of ours, called Source Code Control, and the others from Spain, from ID Law Partners. These Kanban are essentially what has been utilized in the field by these organizations, helping clients become OpenChain conformant. And while not everyone uses Kanban methodologies, it does provide a solid approach of how do I actually implement conformance, apart from doing self-certification on the web app and so on. You know, how do I actually do this? These are both client-facing materials, so they're designed to help another company become conformant, but they're compact, they're easy to understand, and they contain examples, so it's very easy to utilize them as you wish. Another item that's, oh, I see we've got Kanye just joined from Korea. Hey, Kanye. Another piece of material that's probably useful, and this came up last week actually, are our flowcharts. So at the moment, it's English, and Kenya's gone. I guess she doesn't like flowcharts. Just kidding. We've got English and traditional Chinese right now. So the flowcharts are interesting because they're a little bit more nitty-gritty, but they do touch on something that comes up. We just had a conversation in China, and we had another conversation in Taiwan about, does OpenChain help me with the GPL licensing? And the answer, of course, is in terms of your compliance approach, certainly. In terms of the specifics of the license, that's not the purpose of the OpenChain specification, but we have materials such as these flowcharts that provide some overviews of how you can approach things like distribution types and how that leads into controls. So let's just pick up distribution in a device, flowchart 2. Try to find that. I think that's a product. And it just shows in a general overview how your workflow can go to address that, you know, how you can manage these activities. These flowcharts, and you can understand what's official in OpenChain and what's not, because under the category such as flowcharts, it says official or community. These flowcharts are community. They're not the project's ultimate blessing on an approach, but they do provide great material to help people contextualize things. And you'll notice that they're available in multiple formats, precisely to be editable and expandable for your use case. So I thought that's worth highlighting. It was very fortunate when we had the conversation in Taiwan where people were saying, what can I do about the GPL? And the answer is, well, the flowcharts can assist you with some of your direct management of that license and its requirements, because they do touch on that. and it's available in traditional Chinese, which is nice. We'll try to get translations into simplified Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and German up. Okay, so another item I wanted to touch on quickly was the idea of checklists. And, oh, sorry, I touched on the checklists earlier, my apologies. The other item I wanted to touch on actually was to go through our guides. And this is actually a pretty busy part of our repository. So I'm going to split it into community and official. So OpenChain itself has got some information from managers, introductions, and so on. But we have much more material on the community side. On the community side specifically, we've been given some materials which can be tremendously useful in software management in terms of filling out our process. So OpenChain identifies process points, but we don't fill them out. Our guides can assist with that. For example, not the current version, but an earlier version of reuse, an approach to dealing with reusing software, was contributed to us under CC0. And this particular version of this information allows people to relatively, oh dearie me, let me try and find a readable format, allows people to relatively quickly work out how they can approach reusing software. And because this documentation was provided under CC0, you can adjust this as required by your own department processes. Another example here, which might be interesting, is recommended engineering practices. This particular material is designed to answer the question of how do we deploy into our departments. Another one that we think was quite useful is the build instructions, which, you know, it's not something super complex, but it is something important in the context of GPL. And this guide, it's not a huge guide, but it provides the key information about build instructions that can avoid one of the most common compliance errors, where people receiving the code do not feel that they have adequate or any build instructions provided. Finally, tooling comparisons is interesting. Now, this one's a moving target. We have a tooling work group, and they're constantly working on making this material better. In fact, they're just about to release a much better comparisons document. But we already have documentation on what type of tools, especially open source tools, work for compliance and how do they work. And I think that's really valuable material. In fact, that's one of the things that comes up in conversations, not on the primary project, but certainly very frequently in one-to-ones. All right, pulling back. So, huge amount of information on the repository in multiple languages. We do have a bias on the languages in Chinese and Japanese. That's due to a combination of the local community sizes, but it's also due to the fact that one of the greatest barriers for understanding is found with languages such as Japanese or Chinese, as opposed to in Europe, for example, where most people can utilize English language documentation with minimal friction. Now, of course, there's a lot more material on the GitHub. What I was showing today was mostly stuff that comes up in conversation where people say, I'd really like more help on this side. And sometimes they don't have the discovery of the appropriate material in this GitHub. So this walkthrough is intended to help with that. Our website is about to get a massive revamp that will build on this, that will make it easier to link into the various sections, and in particular, probably expose more of the community material more easily. So some of the great material we have is not official OpenChain documentation, but it's really useful community contributions. And we'll make sure that's more easy to discover on the website. This will be occurring actually this week, ahead of the publication of our ISO standards. So all the new people arriving will find it much easier to get their sea legs. Okay, so that's where I wanted to go on the reference material and the library. In particular, after we had some meetings last week with local communities and they raised questions directly related to material contained here. If you have any questions or comments, they're super appreciated. Just pausing here to check. All right, if there's no questions or comments, then that's it. Thanks for taking a walkthrough on the reference material with me. This is something that we will be disseminating to our local work groups quite actively, so this recording will be going there. Big thank you to Seth for explaining the community specification. That's a little bit special. And a big thank you to Ninoji-san and Dave for dialing in, especially Ninoji-san because it's a vacation day.
That was great. Thanks, Shane.
Super welcome. Everyone have a great day. Stay safe.
Thanks
and
for inviting me.
take care.